Hello, I'm Hideaki Hata. This video is a presentation of a paper, GitHub sponsors, exploring a new way to contribute to open source, accepted for the technical track of ICSE 2022. We studied GitHub sponsors, which allow the developer community to financially support people and organizations working on open source projects on which they depend directly on GitHub. Open source software projects are often affected by economic challenges, and soliciting donation is a common means of obtaining funds for OSS projects. However, many OSS maintainers and developers do not generate enough income to sustain their OSS project. In May 2019, GitHub introduced GitHub Sponsors, a service which allows OSS developers to accept donations from other GitHub users. While most OSS donation services in the past have targeted projects, GitHub Sponsors is unique in that it allows users to donate to individual OSS developers. GitHub advertises the service as a new way to contribute to open source, in particular pointing out the widespread dependence on OSS projects. In this work, we conduct an exploratory study on GitHub Sponsors. Although GitHub Sponsors allows GitHub users to sponsor organizations as well as individuals, this study only focuses on the sponsorship of individual developers. Also, this study only targets sponsorship by individual developers and does not cover sponsorship by organizations. The main goal of the study is to gain insights into the use of GitHub sponsors among individuals. Based on this goal, we constructed three main research questions to guide our study. For RQ1, we investigated the characteristics of the participants in GitHub sponsors. Then, for RQ2, we aimed to identify the characteristics of developers who are likely to obtain sponsorship. To deepen our investigation of the answers to RQ2, we then asked the corresponding why questions for RQ3. Again, from both sides of a potential donation, why are developers looking for sponsorship and why are developers sponsoring? We assume that the main challenge related to sponsorship is not receiving money, so we asked about this explicitly in RQ 3.2. Since there is no direct way to get the users who participate in GitHub sponsors, we first examine repositories to get a list of contributing GitHub users. For more contributors to the more than 1.2 million repositories, we identified sponsored developers and non-sponsored developers who are seeking sponsorship but have not yet obtained it, as well as individual sponsors. Let's see the results. We consider the most common primary language in the repositories to which each developer has contributed to be that developer's primary language. As seen in the table on the left, we found that JavaScript, Python, and PHP are the most frequent primary languages for GitHub-sponsored participants. As we see in the viral plots on the number of contributing repositories and the highest number of stars in the contributing repositories, shown on the right, sponsored developers are more active in popular projects compared to non-sponsored developers. When we drew a similar viral plot for sponsors, we found that the sponsors were also active OSS developers. Of the approximately 3,700 sponsored developers, 22% are also sponsors, suggesting that the developers are sponsoring each other. Therefore, as shown in the figure on the right, we built a network with developers as nodes and sponsorship as edges. The node size corresponds to the total number of sponsorship inputs and outputs. Developers, whose main language is one of the top 10 major programming languages, are color-coded. In this network, we can see that developers of the same main programming languages such as JavaScript, PHP, C#, and Ruby form clusters. In particular, we find that PHP developers form the largest clusters and have a strong social network of donation through GitHub sponsors. To answer RQ2, we employed a decision tree to examine the characteristics that are important in separating sponsored developers from non-sponsored developers. The feature non-repos top contributing is the number of repositories contributed to with the top number of commits and that have at least one sponsor in the same repository. This does not take into account who the sponsors in the same repository are sponsoring. This feature is found to be the most important. That is, the existence of such repository seems to be the most common characteristic of sponsored developers. In other words, in order to acquire sponsors, it is important not only to make top-level contributions to popular projects, but also to have someone with experience in sponsoring nearby. Sponsorship culture in the community can be an interesting research topic. We also surveyed developers on important factors to consider when deciding who to sponsor. As expected, being a major contributor to an important OSS project was a very important criterion. In terms of the criterion of inspirational, the majority of responses were positive. Because of the individual sponsorship, personal attractiveness seems to be important. Frequent responses to the criterion of contributing to the same project were a little important, not important at all, and don't care. It is not important criterion for everyone, but it shows that some people do care about it. Knowing each other is mostly considered not important at all or don't care. This is a result of coding the reason for asking for donation from the survey responses. As we see, the majority referred to financial support in general terms. Some sponsored developers started to accept donations to receive recognition and appreciation of their works and effort. We summarized the answers regarding the impact of getting or not getting sponsorship. We found that most of the sponsored developers have not been affected by having sponsors. The second most frequently mentioned impact is motivation. For non-sponsored developers, being able to dedicate only limited effort is the most common impact from not having sponsors. We also analyzed the responses of the reasons why developers sponsor other OSS developers. We found that having dependencies on the code written by the receivers of the sponsorship, recognition, appreciation are the most frequently mentioned reasons for all different roles of OSS developers. Finally, I'd like to share some implications and future challenges from this study. While donation to open source projects is not necessarily new, our study confirmed that some sponsors do indeed see sponsorship as an alternative to contributing code. Most of the sponsors are active developers themselves. However, if they do not have sufficient time, sponsorship can be an effective way for them to show their support and appreciation. A unique feature of GitHub sponsors is its focus on enabling sponsorship of individual developers rather than entire project. As a side effect of this, an individual developer's social network is an important determination of whether or not they are able to attract funding. In our study, we identified several clusters in the network of sponsorship relationships, among sponsored developers. While we only examine sponsorship by individual developers, organizational sponsorship is also an important aspect and should be analyzed in future studies. It is also interesting future research topics to investigate how sponsorship to individuals affect the sustainability of OSS project and whether sponsors-only repositories can disrupt the current OSS model. Please access our research dataset via this QR code. Thank you.